The small town of Darrowville had always carried an uneasy quiet on Halloween. By nightfall, the streets were usually deserted, as if the old homes and crooked lampposts were holding their breath. That was part of the charm, though, the kind of charm that kept Darrowville on the outskirts of modern life, suspended in time. But on this particular Halloween night in 1936, a different kind of anticipation hung in the air. People gathered around their radios with an eagerness that had been building for days. WHMN, Darrowville's only local station, had announced a special Halloween broadcast, an hour-long horror show guaranteed to chill your bones. The host was someone no one had ever heard of, a man named Robert Faulkner, and his deep, gravelly voice had teased the upcoming show all week with cryptic phrases. We'll be telling tales of the forgotten, but beware, some things should never be remembered. The clock struck 8, and as if on cue, radios in every household crackled to life. The sound of soft static drifted through the speakers, followed by Faulkner's voice, a rich, velvety tone that seemed to pour into every corner of the room. "Good evening, dear listeners," Faulkner began, his words slow and deliberate. "Tonight, we have a very special story for you. A story of voices long forgotten, but not silent." The air seemed to thicken as he spoke. In the Harper household, young Jimmy Harper sat cross-legged on the floor by the radio, eyes wide. His parents were on the sofa behind him, half listening as they read their books. In the Johnson home across town, old Mrs. Johnson clutched her knitting, though her hands had stilled as Faulkner's voice filled the room. For the first few minutes, the story was typical enough. Faulkner described an old mansion on the edge of a dense forest, long abandoned and rumored to be haunted by the voices of those who had once lived there. "It is said," Faulkner continued, "that the house could never truly be empty, for the walls themselves carried the whispers of its long-dead residents." A gust of wind rattled the shutters on the Harper home, and Jimmy flinched, glancing nervously toward the window. His father chuckled under his breath. "It's just a story, Jimmy. No need to get all worked up." But the radio's static suddenly deepened, and Faulkner's voice grew fainter, as if struggling to come through the speakers. "And when the clock strikes midnight," Faulkner said, his words barely audible now, "they say the voices come alive again." The radio crackled loudly, a harsh burst of static that made Jimmy's mother jump. The next sound wasn't Faulkner's voice at all. It was a low, whispering hiss. The words were impossible to make out, but the sound of them sent a chill through the room. "What the devil is wrong with this thing?" Mr. Harper grumbled, leaning forward to fiddle with the dials. But the whispering continued, like a breeze carrying secrets through a hollow cave. Across town, in a dozen other homes, listeners were experiencing the same thing. The broadcast had changed, distorted. Some swore they heard faint footsteps. Others claimed they could make out voices beneath the static, voices too soft to understand, but unmistakably human. Yet Faulkner's voice never returned. The Johnsons' radio sputtered and screeched again, and Mrs. Johnson frowned, her hands clenching around her knitting needles. "Sounds like it's coming from the walls," she muttered to herself, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Then, all at once, the radio's whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. In the Harper household, Jimmy's heart raced. He glanced up at his father, who looked as pale as the white pages of his book. "Dad," Jimmy whispered, but his voice was drowned out by the return of Faulkner's voice, booming through the speaker now, loud and clear. "Are you listening?" Faulkner asked, his voice cold and menacing. "Because they're listening to you." And then the broadcast went dead. The morning after the strange broadcast, the town of Darrowville buzzed with murmurs of what had happened. Most of the townspeople laughed it off as a Halloween prank, a clever radio trick to spook the more gullible listeners. But for a few, something about the night had lingered, unsettling, like an echo they couldn't quite place. At the local diner, the usual breakfast crowd gathered. Plates clattered, and the smell of coffee filled the air. But today there was a tension beneath the surface. Conversations were hushed, punctuated by nervous glances. "I'm telling you," old Mrs. Johnson said, leaning across her booth to talk to the Harpers. "It wasn't just the radio. I heard something in my house last night. After the broadcast cut off, there were noises, footsteps, I swear it. And that voice, it didn't feel like it was just in the radio. It was closer." Jimmy Harper, seated next to his father, stiffened. He hadn't been able to shake the eerie sensation he felt after Faulkner's final words. "Are you listening? Because they're listening to you." The memory of those chilling words had kept him awake all night, staring at the shadows in his room. His parents had reassured him it was just a radio show, a Halloween gimmick. But deep down, Jimmy knew something was wrong. "It's just your imagination, Mabel," Mr. Harper replied, his voice unconvincing. "Radio broadcasts can get staticky, especially on stormy nights like last night. They probably threw in some extra sound effects to get everyone worked up. That's all." Mrs. Johnson pursed her lips, clearly unconvinced. "Worked up? Maybe. But it wasn't just me. Sarah Collins called me this morning. She said her radio started playing strange noises after midnight. And..." She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening as she looked toward the diner's window. Jimmy followed her gaze and felt a shiver run down his spine. A figure stood just outside the glass, staring in at them. A man. But something was wrong. His face was pale, gaunt, and his eyes were unfocused, as if he were in a trance. He stood motionless, his breath fogging the window. "Who the hell is that?" Mr. Harper muttered, his eyes narrowing. He got up and walked toward the door, but as he did, the man slowly turned and shuffled away, disappearing around the corner of the diner. "Creeps in this town," Mr. Harper said, shaking his head. "Probably just some vagrant." But his voice held an edge of doubt. Back at the table, Jimmy's pulse quickened. He couldn't explain why, but the man's appearance had struck a chord of pure fear in him. He had looked familiar somehow, and the way he had stood there, staring. "Dad," Jimmy whispered, his voice trembling. I think I saw that man last night, outside my window." His father's face hardened. "Don't be ridiculous, Jimmy. You were half asleep. Your mind's playing tricks." But Jimmy knew what he had seen. Just as he had started to drift off to sleep the night before, he'd glanced out his window. A figure had been standing in the street, staring up at his house, motionless in the pale moonlight. He had thought it was his imagination, but now, the same figure had appeared at the diner. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, more people began to report strange occurrences. Over at the schoolhouse, Miss Maynard, the schoolteacher, said she had heard whispers coming from the chalkboard as she erased the day's lessons. And old man Tobias swore his radio had turned itself on in the middle of the night, broadcasting nothing but static and faint, indecipherable voices. By dusk, it was clear that the eerie feeling lingering over Darrowville had spread. A creeping sense of dread settled over the town like an uninvited guest. People began locking their doors earlier than usual, their eyes scanning the darkened streets as if they expected to see something lurking just beyond the reach of the light. At the Harper house, Jimmy sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at his dinner. His mind was elsewhere, haunted by the strange events of the day. His father had tried to brush it off, but Jimmy could tell even he was on edge. The entire town seemed to be. Suddenly, the radio in the living room crackled to life, filling the house with the low hum of static. Jimmy's fork clattered to his plate, and he exchanged a panicked glance with his mother. Without a word, Mr. Harper stood up, his face set in a grim frown, and walked toward the radio. His fingers hovered over the dial, but just as he reached for it, the static faded, replaced by a familiar voice. "Good evening, Darrowville," Faulkner's voice purred through the speakers. "I hope you're still listening. The story isn't over yet." A cold shudder ran through Jimmy's body. The radio had been off, but the voice had found them anyway. By the third night, the entire town was on edge. Darrowville was no stranger to gossip, but this was different. People weren't just whispering rumors, they were afraid. The radio broadcast hadn't ended on Halloween as expected. Instead, it had started creeping into their lives, leaking out of the airwaves and into the very fabric of the town. At first, people thought it was a technical glitch, radios turning on by themselves, faint voices at odd hours, strange distortions in the air. But soon it became clear it wasn't just technology acting up. Something more sinister was at play. In the Harper household, the unease was palpable. Jimmy had hardly slept since that night at the diner. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined that pale man standing outside his window, watching. The whispers from the radio still echoed in his head, twisting his dreams into nightmares. "Dad, it's happening again," Jimmy said one evening as the family sat in the living room, trying to pretend life was still normal. The old radio sat on the mantel, its wooden frame catching the firelight. They hadn't turned it on since the last time Faulkner's voice had come through uninvited. Mr. Harper shot his son a look of annoyance. "Jimmy, we've talked about this. It's just a malfunction. The station probably..." A low hum interrupted him. The radio crackled to life on its own, cutting him off. They all froze, eyes locked on the device as the room filled with static. The same voice came through, but this time, it was softer, almost whispering. "Still listening, Darrowville? You should be, because tonight, they're closer." Jimmy's mother gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. "Turn it off," she whispered. "Turn it off now." Mr. Harper moved toward the radio, his face pale with a fear he could no longer hide. But when his hand touched the dial, it wouldn't budge. The static grew louder, filling the room, and Faulkner's voice rose with it. "You think you can shut me out? You think turning a dial can stop the truth?" The lights in the house flickered, and for a moment, the static seemed to take on a life of its own, swirling through the air like something alive, something unseen, but felt. Jimmy clung to the arm of the chair, his heart pounding. He swore he heard other voices behind Faulkner's, low, rasping whispers that seemed to surround them. With a grunt, Mr. Harper yanked the plug from the wall. The radio went dead, the static vanishing instantly. For a moment, there was silence. Only the crackling of the fireplace broke the tension. Jimmy's mother sagged in her chair, trembling. "We need to call someone. The station. The police. Something's wrong." Mr. Harper nodded, but his face was grim. "I'll drive to WHMN tomorrow. I want answers." He glanced at the clock. It was barely past 9, but the night already felt like it had dragged on forever. Jimmy barely slept that night. His room felt too quiet, too still, as if the house itself were holding its breath. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. Why was this happening? What was the broadcast doing to them? At some point, exhaustion won out, and Jimmy slipped into a restless sleep. But it wasn't long before something woke him. A faint noise, So soft it was barely more than a whisper. At first he thought it was just the wind. Then it came again. A voice, low and rasping, like someone murmuring just outside his bedroom door. They're closer. His heart skipped a beat. He sat up, straining to listen. The voice was coming from downstairs. Or was it inside his own head? Terrified, Jimmy crept out of bed and down the hallway, his bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. As he approached the staircase, the air felt colder, and the whispers grew clearer. "You can't stop us." They were coming from the living room. He stepped cautiously to the top of the stairs and peered down. The room was dark, lit only by the dying embers of the fireplace. But something was wrong. The radio, it was on again, even though it was unplugged. Jimmy's breath hitched. The static filled the air, but this time there was no voice, just a low, steady hum. And then, movement. In the corner of the room, by the window, a shadow flickered. It was the man again, the same gaunt figure he'd seen outside the diner. But this time he wasn't just staring. He was moving toward the radio. Jimmy backed away, his foot catching the edge of the rug. He stumbled, and the creak of the floorboard gave him away. The figure froze, its head slowly turning toward him. And then, in a voice that was not Faulkner's but deeper, hollow, and impossibly cold, it whispered, "Come closer." Jimmy ran. He didn't stop until he was back in his room. The door slammed shut behind him, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers had followed him up the stairs, growing louder, filling the hallway like an invisible tide. For the first time, he realized the truth. The broadcast wasn't just in the radio anymore. It was everywhere. The next morning, Darrowville felt different. The air had an unnatural stillness, like the calm before a storm. It was the kind of quiet that pressed on the senses, making even the most familiar sights, the tree-lined streets, the old shops, the faces of neighbors, seem strange and distant. The radio broadcast had taken hold of the town in a way no one could have anticipated. Jimmy's father kept his word. Shortly after sunrise, he packed the family into the car and headed toward WHMN's station on the edge of town. The building, a squat brick structure with tall radio towers looming overhead, looked abandoned when they arrived. No lights, no movement. As they stepped out of the car, the only sound was the hum of the towers and the faint buzz of static that seemed to cling to the air. "Are you sure someone's even here?" Jimmy's mother asked, glancing nervously at the building. "They have to be," Mr. Harper said, though he didn't sound convinced. "I need to know who's behind this. Someone is playing with us, and it stops now." As they approached the front door, Jimmy felt a shiver run through him. Something wasn't right. The building felt wrong, as if it had been forgotten, like a relic of another time. His father knocked, but no one answered. The windows were dark, and the door creaked open easily under his touch. Inside, the station was worse. Dust clung to every surface, and the air smelled stale, like no one had been there in years. Jimmy followed closely behind his parents as they stepped into the dim lobby. The silence was suffocating. "There's no one here," his mother whispered, her voice shaking. "Let's just check the studio," Mr. Harper said, already moving toward a hallway lined with old photographs of WHMN's past broadcasts. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch them as they passed, black and white images of radio hosts and guests frozen in time. The deeper they went into the station, the more unsettling it became. The faint sound of static buzzed louder the closer they got to the main studio, the air growing colder with every step. When they reached the studio door, Mr. Harper hesitated. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He pushed the door open and the family stepped inside. The studio was a mess. Papers and equipment lay scattered across the floor, as if someone had left in a hurry. In the center of the room was an old-fashioned microphone, standing eerily untouched, as though waiting for a voice to speak into it. "That's it," Jimmy's father muttered, running a hand through his hair. "There's no one here. It's like this place hasn't been used in..." The radio on the control panel sprang to life, cutting him off mid-sentence. Static filled the air, and then Faulkner's voice came through, calm and chilling. "Good morning, Darrowville. I see you've come to the source." Jimmy's mother gasped, clutching his arm. "How is it still broadcasting? There's no one here." Faulkner's voice continued, but now there was something different about it. Something darker, more sinister. "You're part of the story now. You should have stayed home, but since you've come this far, why not listen a little longer?" Suddenly, the studio lights flickered, casting long shadows across the room. Jimmy's heart raced. The buzzing static was louder now, almost deafening, and with it came something else. Those faint, whispering voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "I think we should leave," his mother said, her voice trembling. "Now." But when they turned toward the door, something blocked their path. A shadow, dark and shapeless, seemed to stretch across the floor, moving toward them like smoke. It wasn't human, just a mass of swirling blackness that made the air around it freeze. Jimmy felt the temperature drop instantly, his breath turning to fog in front of him. He stumbled backward, eyes wide as the shadow closed in. The whispers grew louder, filling the room, each voice overlapping the next, until it was impossible to make out what they were saying. "We're trapped," Jimmy whispered, his voice barely audible over the growing noise. The radio hissed again, and Faulkner's voice returned, low and mocking. "There's no escape now. The signal is everywhere." The walls around them seemed to pulse with the sound, vibrating with unseen energy. The static was in the air, in their heads growing louder, more intense. Jimmy clutched his ears, trying to block it out, but it was useless. The broadcast was inside them now, a part of the very air they breathed. Mr. Harper grabbed Jimmy's arm, pulling him toward the control panel. "There has to be a way to stop it. There has to be." But the radio seemed to pulse with life, its dials spinning on their own, the microphone crackling with energy. Faulkner's voice echoed through the room again, colder than ever. "You can't stop the signal, Darrowville. You're already part of it." And then the whispers came again, louder, clearer. This time Jimmy understood them. "Come closer. Come closer." The shadow stretched further, swallowing the room in darkness. The darkness enveloped them, smothering the studio in an unnatural cold. Jimmy's breath came in ragged gasps, his pulse hammering in his ears as he tried to see through the black mist swirling around them. His father gripped his arm tightly, and for a moment, the only sound was the deafening hum of the radio signal echoing in the room. But then, through the suffocating dark, something shifted. A faint, flickering light at the far end of the room, like a door cracking open. The shadow wavered, momentarily retreating, as if it was afraid of the light. "This way!" Mr. Harper shouted, pulling Jimmy and his mother toward the light. They stumbled forward, the cold air biting at their skin as they pushed through the shadow. With every step, the whispers grew louder, surrounding them, echoing from the very walls. The light led them into a narrow hallway at the back of the studio, dimly lit by a flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. It looked different from the rest of the station, older, more decayed, as if this part of the building had been abandoned for decades. The walls were cracked, peeling and lined with dust-covered photographs. "What is this place?" Jimmy's mother whispered, her voice shaky. "It's like it doesn't belong here." Mr. Harper didn't answer, his eyes locked on a door at the end of the hallway. Faded letters above it spelled out, "Studio B, restricted access." "Maybe this is where they were broadcasting from," Mr. Harper muttered. "We need to figure out what's really going on." As they moved closer to the door, a strange sensation crept over Jimmy, like something was watching them from behind the walls. The air was thick with that same static hum, growing louder as they approached. His heart raced, but curiosity gnawed at him. What had happened here? Who, or what, was behind all this? Mr. Harper grabbed the rusted doorknob and pushed. The door creaked open with an eerie groan, revealing a small, dim room beyond. Inside, a dusty console sat against the far wall, cluttered with old recording equipment and worn-out tapes. And sitting in the center of the room, slouched in a chair, was a figure. Jimmy's breath caught in his throat. The man was gaunt, his skin pale and almost translucent, his eyes sunken and vacant. His clothes were worn and tattered, and he looked as though he had been sitting there for years. But what was most unnerving was the microphone in front of him. It was still crackling softly, as if waiting for him to speak. "Is that Faulkner?" Jimmy's mother asked, her voice trembling. Mr. Harper moved cautiously toward the figure, waving his hand in front of the man's face. There was no reaction, no movement at all. He was as still as a corpse. "I think he's dead," Mr. Harper whispered. "But then, who's been broadcasting?" As if in response, the radio on the console crackled to life again. Faulkner's voice echoed through the room, cold and eerie. "Ah, you found him," the voice said. "The original host of WHMN. But Robert Faulkner's been gone for quite some time." Jimmy felt his stomach drop. The voice, it wasn't coming from the man in the chair. It was coming from somewhere else, somewhere unseen. "What do you mean?" Mr. Harper demanded, spinning around. "Who are you?" The voice chuckled, low and sinister. "I've been here all along. I've always been here, waiting for the right moment to come back." The lights in the room flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. The figure in the chair seemed to blur for a moment, its edges wavering, as though it wasn't entirely solid. "Faulkner was just a vessel," the voice continued. "A mouthpiece for something far older, something that has lived in the signal since the first broadcast. I was there when he disappeared. And now, I found a new audience." Jimmy's heart pounded in his chest. "What are you? What do you want?" The voice was closer now, filling the room like a presence. "I am the echo of every forgotten voice, the static between the stations, the void that waits in the silence. And what I want is for you all to hear me." Suddenly, the equipment on the console sparked to life, dials spinning wildly, the microphone buzzing with energy. The shadows in the room deepened, pressing in from all sides, and the air grew colder. Mr. Harper yanked Jimmy and his mother toward the door. "We have to get out of here now!" But the door slammed shut before they could reach it, the handle twisting violently on its own. The room trembled as the voice rose, more powerful, more menacing. "There is no escape, Darrowville. The signal is everywhere, and once you've heard me, you're mine." The lights flickered one last time and then died completely, plunging the room into darkness. The static was deafening now, a wall of sound that pressed against them, suffocating. The shadows seemed to stretch and coil, moving with purpose, like something was lurking just beyond the edge of sight. And then, from the darkness, The voice whispered again, soft but clear. "You're already part of the broadcast." The suffocating darkness pressed in around them, swallowing the room in a void of static and shadow. Jimmy clung to his mother's arm as the disembodied voice echoed in his head. "You're already part of the broadcast." His heart hammered in his chest, and the cold air felt heavy with something unseen, something ancient. "We have to get out," Mr. Harper muttered, his voice tight with panic. He pulled at the door, but it remained stubbornly shut, as if sealed by the very air itself. The walls around them seemed to pulse with the eerie hum of the broadcast, growing louder with each second, as if the station itself had come alive. Jimmy's mother whispered, "What do we do now? We can't stay here. That thing, it's trapped us." Mr. Harper's eyes darted to the radio console in the corner of the room. The equipment crackled, and the lights on the panel flickered weakly as though it was struggling to stay powered. "Maybe," he said slowly, "we can destroy the source. If the broadcast can't continue, maybe it'll stop." "But how?" Jimmy asked, his voice trembling. "That thing, it's everywhere. How do we even know it'll work?" "We don't," Mr. Harper admitted grimly, "but it's the only chance we've got." Without waiting for another word, Mr. Harper lunged toward the console, yanking at wires and smashing dials. The equipment sparked and sputtered as he ripped cables from their sockets, sending a shower of sparks into the air. The room filled with the acrid smell of burning wires, and the static buzz grew louder, as if protesting the assault. For a brief moment, Jimmy thought it was working. The oppressive hum in the air faltered, and the flickering light steadied. But then, with a bone-chilling crackle, the voice returned, colder and more furious than ever. "You think you can stop me? I am more than this signal. I am the silence that follows." The shadows in the room writhed like living things, curling up the walls and across the floor, creeping closer. Jimmy's breath caught in his throat as he saw shapes forming within the darkness. Faces, hollow and pale, eyes wide with fear. They were the faces of those who had once listened to the phantom broadcast, now trapped in its endless echo. "It's not enough!" Jimmy shouted, backing away from the growing darkness. "We need to destroy it all!" "There!" his mother cried, pointing toward the corner of the room where the old microphone stood, untouched despite the chaos. The black metal gleamed faintly in the dim light, and Jimmy realized with a cold certainty that the microphone was more than just a piece of equipment. It was the heart of the signal, the place where the voice had been reborn. "That's it," Mr. Harper said, racing toward the microphone. "We destroy this, we end it." But as he reached for it, a shadow surged forward, wrapping itself around his arm. Mr. Harper cried out, struggling against the cold, suffocating grip as it pulled him back. "Go, destroy it," he shouted, his voice tight with pain. "Don't let it trap us here." Without thinking, Jimmy grabbed a heavy metal wrench from the floor and rushed toward the microphone. His heart pounded, his fear screaming at him to run, but he knew there was no running from this. They were already caught in the web of the phantom broadcast, and the only way out was to end it. As he raised the wrench above his head, the voice screamed through the room, a piercing guttural sound that rattled his bones. "You can't escape me! I've been here long before your time, and I'll be here long after!" Jimmy slammed the wrench down onto the microphone with all his strength. The moment it connected, the sound was deafening, a high-pitched screech of metal and static that reverberated through the room. The shadows recoiled, twisting violently, and the faces within them contorted in silent screams. The room shook, the equipment around them sparking and exploding in bursts of light. But Jimmy didn't stop. He brought the wrench down again and again, each strike sending a wave of force through the room. The microphone cracked, shattered, and then with one final blow, it disintegrated into pieces, scattering across the floor. For a second, nothing happened. The static buzzed in the air, the shadows trembled at the edges of the room, and then silence. The static stopped. The shadows faded, retreating into the corners of the room until they vanished completely. The oppressive weight that had filled the air lifted, leaving only the soft sound of their ragged breathing. Jimmy stood there, panting, his heart still racing as he stared at the broken pieces of the microphone. His father staggered forward, free of the shadow's grasp, and collapsed beside him. "You did it," Mr. Harper whispered, his voice weak. "You stopped it." His mother knelt beside them, wrapping her arms around Jimmy. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jimmy nodded, though a lingering doubt still gnawed at him. The silence was unnerving, too deep, too final, as if the air itself was holding its breath. The radio station around them was still, untouched by the chaos of the last few minutes. But as the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the boarded windows, the fear that had gripped them began to ease. The nightmare, it seemed, had ended. They stumbled out of WHMN into the quiet streets of Darrowville. The town was eerily calm, but the oppressive tension had lifted. The broadcast was over, or so they thought. As they drove back home, Jimmy glanced at the old radio in the car's dashboard. For a moment, he swore he saw the dial twitch, just a little, as if tuning to a frequency that wasn't quite gone. And then, just at the edge of his hearing, a faint whisper. "Are you still listening?" But the whisper faded, and the world returned to silence.